The call came in at 03:47 station time, which meant nobody senior was awake to override him. Marcus Vale had been waiting for exactly that. He pulled himself into the relay chair, cracked his knuckles the way his mother had always told him not to, and started typing. The Keshari Oversight Probe, KOP-7, the one they'd named after some untranslatable concept in the alien diplomatic lexicon that the interpreter bots had given up on and rendered simply as Warden, had drifted 11 degrees off its prescribed orbital corridor. In 42 minutes, it would intersect with the debris field from the Battle of Meridian Station. In 43 minutes, 300 kilograms of Keshari surveillance hardware worth more than the GDP of a mid-tier colony world would become a very expensive cloud of shrapnel. And in 44 minutes, someone would be looking for someone to blame. Marcus ran the correction burn in his head before he touched the console, not because he needed to show off, because the math was the only honest thing left in the building. He executed the burn in 4 precise pulses, walked the probe back into its lane, and had it locked and logging before the automated alarm had finished sounding its first cycle. He closed the alert, leaned back, let out a breath that tasted like recycled air and bad coffee. "You saved it," said a voice behind him. Ferris, his supervisor, standing in the doorway in civilian clothes, holding a mug, looking at Marcus the way people look at an old dog that's still got tricks. "I saved their probe," Marcus said. "Not quite the same thing. They'll want to know how it happened. Resonance drift in the stabilizer gyro. Solvable. I already filed the patch recommendation." He paused. "They won't implement it." "No," Ferris agreed. "They won't." That was the shape of things. 6 years into the Keshari Compact. They called it a partnership. They meant supervision. The alien Keshari had arrived with their curved hull ships and their luminescent skin and their gift packages of advanced propulsion theory, and humanity had done what humanity always does, been so grateful for the toys that it took a while to notice the leash. Marcus had noticed early. It hadn't made him popular. He gathered his jacket from the back of the chair and walked out past Ferris without saying anything else, because there was nothing else worth saying at 04:00 in the morning, and because the thing he actually wanted to say would have ended his career before breakfast. The summons came 11 days later. Not a summons officially, an invitation for collaborative review. The Keshari Compact language was always like that. Every demand wrapped in the grammar of a request, every ultimatum dressed up as a suggestion, every command preceded by the phrase, "It would be beneficial if." Marcus had been told he was being loaned to the Compact's Interspecies Research Council for a period of mutual enrichment. He packed a bag. He did not tell anyone where he was going, because nobody who knew would have believed him anyway. The ISRC facility was on the far side of the moon. Not the human-built installations clustered around the equatorial belt, but the Keshari's own structure, the one that had materialized in geosynchronous orbit in year 2 of the Compact, and then descended to the surface over the course of 3 months, settling into a crater with the slow, deliberate patience of something that had been doing this for a long time. From the outside, it looked like a cathedral designed by an engineer who had never seen a cathedral, but had been given a very thorough description of one. From the inside, it looked like the inside of a living thing. Marcus checked in at the entrance, a human checkpoint staffed by humans, because the Keshari had learned early that humans were more cooperative when they felt like they were in charge of at least the lobby, and was escorted by a human liaison named Dreyer to a briefing room that was not quite the right shape for a room. The ceiling was half a meter too high. The angles of the walls diverged by about 6 degrees from true right angles. The table was the right height, but the chairs were slightly too wide, as if designed for bodies that were slightly too wide. It was all technically accommodating. It was also, at a level below conscious thought, persistently wrong. Marcus sat in one of the too wide chairs and waited. The Keshari who entered the room a few minutes later were two: a coordinating officer whose name translated roughly as Stillwater, and a translator adjunct whose name Marcus had never gotten a clean rendering of and had given up trying. They sat across from him with the particular Keshari posture that always looked to human eyes like formal relaxation, like cats sitting in judgment. Their skin ran through a slow cycling of pale amber and ivory, the bioluminescent patterns that served as emotional subchannel, moving in rhythms that the translation software caught maybe 60% of. "Dr. Vale," Stillwater said, in the precise accentless English that the senior Keshari used, "we appreciate your cooperation." "I was told it was optional," Marcus said. "Many things are optional," Stillwater said, and left it there. The briefing was about what Marcus had expected and worse than he'd feared. The compact was expanding its mandate, deepening the collaborative framework, in the official language. A new research initiative was being launched, the Temporal Mechanics Integration Project, and it required a human scientist with specific expertise in relativistic field mathematics. Marcus had been identified as the most suitable candidate. He would be given access to Keshari theoretical archives that no human researcher had previously seen. He would be expected, in return, to contribute his expertise toward the project's goals. What the project's goals were, specifically, was not discussed. "What am I actually building?" Marcus asked, when the briefing had concluded and the room was quiet. Stillwater's skin ran a brief pattern that the translator rendered as something between appreciation and amusement. "The project will be clarified in stages," he said, "as trust develops." "Trust," Marcus said. "Trust," Stillwater agreed. Marcus looked at his hands on the too-wide table. He thought about the probe he'd saved at 0347. He thought about the patch recommendation that wouldn't be implemented. He thought about the word warden. "All right," he said, "I'm in." The Keshari archives were extraordinary. Marcus had known they would be. He'd prepared himself for extraordinary, built up a layer of professional detachment around himself like insulation, told himself he would observe and analyze and not be dazzled. The preparation lasted about 4 hours. The theoretical framework for what the Keshari called temporal field navigation, what the translation bots, evidently feeling playful, had rendered as time walking, was not just more advanced than human physics. It was more advanced in a direction human physics hadn't known existed. Like finding out you'd been solving a 3-dimensional puzzle in 2 dimensions, and the 3rd dimension didn't just add depth, it contained the answer. He worked for 9 months in the ISRC facility. He slept in quarters that were too wide, ate in a cafeteria that was staffed by humans and therefore correctly proportioned, ran his calculations in a workspace that smelled faintly of the ozone and copper scent that Keshari technology always seemed to produce, and he built. He didn't ask about the project's goals. He told himself he was waiting for the trust to develop. He told himself a lot of things. The machine he built, that he and 3 Keshari engineers built, though he was the one who understood why each piece went where it went, was smaller than he'd expected given what it did. It looked like a chair surrounded by a framework, which was more or less what it was, a specifically shaped electromagnetic environment that could, in the terminology he developed for his own notes because the Keshari language didn't quite map to it, fold a body through the substrate of causal sequence. It could move a person through time. Forward specifically, the math for backward travel was in the archives. Marcus had read it. He had not included it in his design. He told himself that was a technical decision. The first trial, unmanned, a small sensor package, confirmed the math. The second and third trials confirmed the first. The fourth trial put a rat named after Marcus's ex-colleague Ferris approximately 6 weeks into the future, and the rat came back, via the machine's return function, the only part he'd been required to make 2-directional, perfectly healthy and mildly confused. Marcus named the rat proof of concept and kept it in his desk. Then Stillwater called him to a meeting, and everything got complicated. The meeting room was different from the first one, larger. The wrong angle problem was more pronounced, and there were more Keshari in it than Marcus had ever been in a room with at once 7 of them, arranged in a loose arc, their bioluminescence running in patterns that the translator software was rendering with more hedging qualifiers than usual. Words like possibly, and this may indicate an uncertain analog. The software was uncertain because the emotional register in the room was something it hadn't encountered before. Marcus sat in the human-scale chair they'd provided for him and looked at the arc of alien faces and thought, "This is a presentation. They're showing me something on purpose." Stillwater stood at the head of the arc. To his left was a Keshari whom Marcus had seen twice before, briefly, at a distance, taller than Stillwater, with a luminescent pattern that moved more slowly and with more deliberate rhythm than the others, and whose presence seemed to affect the room the way a large rock affects a stream, everything flowing around it, ordered by it. "Dr. Vale," Stillwater said, "we would like to introduce you to the director of the integration project." The tall Keshari turned to face him. Marcus had been working alongside Keshari for 9 months. He'd gotten reasonably good at reading them, at noting the differences in height, in luminescent pattern, in the subtle structural variations in their faces that served the same social signaling function as human facial structure. He knew that their aesthetics were different from human aesthetics, and that comparative judgments were largely meaningless. He knew all of this. None of it entirely prepared him for the experience of being looked at by someone who looked like that. It wasn't that she was beautiful exactly. It was more that she was precisely, specifically herself, that every element of how she was assembled seemed to be exactly where it was meant to be, her height, and the line of her shoulders, and the particular slow rhythm of her bioluminescence, and the way she held her head with this quality of absolute calm that Marcus had previously associated only with very large natural features, mountains and deep water and old-growth forests. She was entirely Keshari. She was entirely not human. And she looked at Marcus the way Marcus looked at interesting math problems, with the attentive patience of someone who was genuinely curious about what they were going to find. He realized, several seconds after he should have, that he had stopped thinking and started staring. He looked at his notes. The translator bot, the one built into his earpiece, the decent one that Compact Headquarters had issued him rather than the general use software, was running a message on his display. Luminescence pattern, no direct translation, archaic formal register, significance. Senior position indicator, possibly ceremonial. And then in brackets with 3 question marks, possible translation, sovereign. Marcus looked up from his notes. The tall Keshari said, in English that was not quite Stillwater's precision-tooled accentlessness, but was something more complex. English that sounded like it had been learned from primary sources, from books and recordings and the actual texture of the language rather than from a curriculum. "Dr. Vale, I have read your work," he said, because it was the only honest thing he had left. "I didn't know anyone was reading it." "All things are read," she said. "The question is always who is reading and for what purpose." Her name in the Keshari language was something that the translator rendered as Solen, which wasn't right but was the closest available approximation. She was, Stillwater explained after the meeting, the director of the entire integration project. She had been present in the facility for 3 months. She had apparently been present at several of Marcus's demonstrations in the archive. She had not introduced herself until now. "Why now?" Marcus asked Stillwater, on the walk back from the meeting room. Stillwater's skin ran a pattern that the translator tagged as considered response/delay for diplomatic phrasing. "The director," Stillwater said carefully, "believed it was important to understand the work before engaging with the worker." "Right," Marcus said, "and now she's engaged." Now she is engaged, Stillwater agreed. The next morning, Solène was in his workspace when he arrived. Not standing at his console, she wasn't touching anything. She was standing at the window that looked out over the crater floor, watching the human maintenance crew run their morning checks on the exterior sensors. She stood with her hands loosely clasped behind her back, and her luminescence was running in a low, steady rhythm that the translator said, tentatively, might indicate something like quiet attention. Marcus set down his coffee. "Can I help you?" "I wanted to see how you work," she said, without turning from the window. "The reports tell me what you have built. They don't tell me how you think while you build it." "That's a strange thing to want to know." "I am a director," she said, and now she did turn, and there was something in her expression that might have been, if the concept translated, dry humor. Strange knowledge is professionally necessary. He sat down at his console. She stood at the window. He pulled up the day's calibration runs and started working through them, and after a while he forgot she was there, which was a specific kind of compliment he could never have given anyone else. He lost himself in the numbers and came back to consciousness 20 minutes later to find that she had moved to a position slightly behind and to his left, and was reading his screen over his shoulder with the focused attentiveness of someone who understood what they were reading. "Your compensation algorithm," she said, "for the temporal displacement field boundary." "What about it?" "It's elegant," she said. "The Keshari approach to that problem uses 14 additional equations." Marcus looked at his own algorithm, 4 equations. He'd been pleased with it when he'd found it, and he hadn't let himself be pleased with things in 9 months, so the feeling had stuck. "The 14 equation approach works better at the edge cases," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it will never find a better solution. Your approach might." He turned to look at her, which meant he was looking up slightly because she was taller, which he noted, and then decided not to note. "Is that a compliment or a strategic assessment?" "Both," she said. "They aren't always different." The months that followed were the strangest of Marcus's professional life, and his professional life had included 9 months of building a time machine in a lunar crater. Solène was in his workspace most mornings. She asked questions that cut to the center of things, not the technical center, or not only that, but the conceptual center, the place where a choice had been made and the reason for the choice lived. She had a quality of attention that made him feel, for the first time in years, like the work mattered, not to the compact, not to a bureaucratic mandate, to the question itself. She also, progressively, told him things. Not everything, not the project goals, not yet, but pieces. The Keshari Compact had been doing this for a long time, arriving on worlds with technological gifts, establishing frameworks of cooperation, building towards something. The integration project was the furthest expression of it. The time machine Marcus had built was not the first, it was the best. And what the project intended to do with the best human time machine ever built was, Solène told him one evening when the maintenance crew had gone, and the workspace was quiet, something that he needed to understand properly before he reacted to it. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The Keshari had found, in Marcus's theoretical archives, in papers published by the Mega Defense Consortium 8 years before, papers Marcus had contributed to, papers with his name on them, the foundational mathematics that had led to the Keshari's own temporal field research. His work, his equations. The thing the Compact had been so eager to acquire wasn't just his current expertise. It was the confirmation that the theoretical groundwork for what they'd been building toward for decades had, on Earth, in a paper he'd written at 32 years old in a government research facility, been independently discovered. That the human mind was capable of getting there without being led. That the human mind was, in the specific way the Keshari cared about, worth acquiring. The integration project did not intend to use the time machine to help humanity. It intended to use the time machine, and the human who had made it possible, as proof of concept for the next phase of expansion. Marcus sat with this for a long time. "You're telling me," he said finally, "that you've been using my work to justify doing to the next species what you did to us." Solène was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Her luminescence ran a slow pattern that his earpiece translated, with uncharacteristic confidence. Conflict/internal resolution/decision already made. "Because," she said, "I have read your work, not just your equations, your published papers, your early notes from before the compact. You did not build this machine to help the Keshari expand. You built it because you wanted to understand what was possible." She paused. "I find that I cannot use someone's genuine curiosity as a weapon without telling them first." "That's very ethical of you," Marcus said. His voice came out harder than he meant it to. "No," she said quietly, "it isn't really. If I were truly ethical, I would have told you in month 1. The thing about working in a building full of aliens for a year is that you stop noticing it. You stop noticing the wrong angle walls and the too wide chairs and the ozone copper smell and the bioluminescence cycling through emotions you only half understand. You start noticing other things instead. The specific way Stillwater's skin went still when he was being evasive. The fact that the cafeteria staff, humans, all of them, had started leaving small offerings of their own food near the Keshari break area, and the Keshari had started leaving small offerings near the human break area, and nobody had organized this or mandated it. It had just happened the way things happen when people share space long enough. The way proof of concept the rat had gone from cowering whenever Solène entered the room to sitting up and watching her with the alert, interested attention of a small animal that has decided someone is worth paying attention to. Marcus paid attention to these things because paying attention to things was what he did. It was the same quality that had let him find the 4-equation solution and notice the probe drift at 0347 and build a time machine that worked better than the Keshari version. He paid attention to Solène in the same way, and what he noticed was this. She was not doing what she had been sent here to do. She was doing something else. He wasn't entirely sure she knew what it was yet. He decided, one night over cold coffee and a calibration printout he'd been staring at for an hour without seeing, that he was going to trust her. Not because she'd earned it exactly, because the alternative, taking the half-trust he already had and dismantling it back to nothing, felt like a kind of amputation. And Marcus had survived a lot of things, but he wasn't sure he would survive performing surgery on the only genuine working relationship he'd had in 2 years. He also decided in the same hour that he was going to do something about the integration project, and that he was going to need her help. He brought it to her on a Tuesday, which was an irrelevant detail except that it was the morning after she'd stayed in the workspace until nearly midnight working through a theoretical problem he'd posed as a test of her understanding, and had solved it correctly, and had looked at the solution the way he looked at good solutions, with a specific quality of quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with rightness. "I want to go forward," he said. She looked up from the printout she was reading. "The machine is calibrated for forward travel only," she said carefully. "I know, I designed it that way." He set down his coffee. "I want to go far enough forward to see what happens if the integration project succeeds. I want actual data. Not projections, not models, I want to look at it." The translator in his ear ran a long string of pattern analysis and came back with assessment/weighing. "And if what you see confirms the projections?" she asked. "Then I'll know I was right to be worried," Marcus said, "and I'll have something concrete to bring to the people who need to hear it. And if it confirms the models I was sent here to support." "Then I was wrong," Marcus said, "and you'll have something concrete to support your recommendations with." She was quiet for long enough that proof of concept the rat made a small noise from his desk corner, and then went back to sleep. "There's a third possibility," Solène said. "What you see may be more complicated than either projection." Yeah, Marcus said. Usually is. He went forward 3 times over the course of 6 weeks, and each time he came back to find Solène waiting in the workspace, and his hands not quite steady, and the rat looking at him with round, unconvinced eyes. The first jump took him 40 years out. The compact was still intact. The integration project had succeeded, 17 new species brought under the framework in the period following its formalization. The architecture of it was impressive. It was also, from the inside of the timeline, visibly extractive in a way that from the outside, from the position of receiving the gifts, from the position of being grateful for the toys, was very hard to see. Marcus sat in the forward time for 6 hours and watched and came back and typed his observations in precise, careful language for 3 hours before he felt steady enough to sleep. The second jump took him to a point where one of the 17 species had resisted. He didn't stay long. What he saw confirmed one projection completely and another not at all, and the one it confirmed was not the one Solène had been sent here to support. The third jump was different. He aimed for a specific window, far enough out to see the long arc of what the integration project built, close enough to find something identifiable. He landed in a facility that looked, in its bones, like the ISRC building he'd been working in for a year. The too high ceilings, the divergent wall angles, the smell. It was older. The human construction mixed into it was more confident, not accommodating itself to the Keshari architecture, but sitting alongside it on its own terms, 2 different structural vocabularies occupying the same space without either apologizing. In a museum corridor, one of those preserved context spaces that historical sites develop organically over enough time, he found a display case. In the display case were documents, research papers, early theoretical work in temporal field mathematics. His name was on the third one. Not as a contributor, not as a junior author, as the primary researcher. The plaque beneath it said, in both English and Keshari script, that this work had been foundational, not just to the integration project, but to the subsequent development of what the plaque called the bilateral framework, a term that didn't appear anywhere in the integration project documentation he'd read. The plaque described him as a foundational contributor to the principles of mutual architecture. It was, by any measure, a compliment. It was a compliment about something he hadn't done yet. He stood in front of the display case in a future that hadn't happened, reading about a past he hadn't yet built, and for a moment the recursion of it, the specific strange solitude of being in a time where you are simultaneously a historical figure and a person with a bad back and cold coffee waiting on a desk in a lunar crater, hit him somewhere below the ribs. He pressed one hand flat against the display case glass. He breathed. He came back. He told Solène everything, not in the careful, calibrated language of his written reports. He told her the way he'd told very few people very few things, without editing, without the professional insulation, sitting on the edge of the too-wide workspace table at 11 p.m. with the rat asleep in his jacket pocket, because it had developed the habit of doing that and talking. She listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, the kind that didn't interrupt and didn't rush and didn't fill the silences with reassurances he hadn't asked for. When he finished, she was quiet for a while, and her luminescence ran in slow, complex patterns that his earpiece mostly gave up on. The bilateral framework, she said finally. Yeah. That term doesn't appear in any current compact documentation. No. It implies reciprocity, she said. Genuine reciprocity. Not the compact framework. That's what it sounded like to me. She was quiet again. Then, what you saw, the museum, the plaque, the way the 2 architectural vocabularies sat alongside each other. She paused. You said without either apologizing. Without either apologizing, Marcus confirmed. A long silence. Outside the workspace window, the lunar surface was its usual gray and shadow, indifferent and permanent and old enough to make everything else feel provisional. The integration project, Solène said, in a tone that was nothing like her usual one, slower, more like thinking aloud than speaking, is not what I was told it was. I know, Marcus said. I was told it was the most successful model of cross-species integration the Keshari had developed. I think, Marcus said carefully, that depends heavily on how you define success. Her luminescence ran a pattern the translator tried 4 times and then rendered as no available human emotional analog, possible closest approximation. The specific quality of seeing something clearly for the first time that you have been looking at incorrectly for a long time. I need to bring what you found back to the council, she said. I know. It will be complicated. I know. Marcus. His name in her mouth was a slightly different word than it was in anyone else's. She'd started using it about 3 months in, and he'd stopped noticing and then noticed again and then stopped again, the way you do with things that are only remarkable if you keep reminding yourself to find them remarkable. What I am about to tell you, I am telling you as an individual, not as a director, as myself. Okay, he said. I was sent here to acquire a technology. I was not sent here to question the purposes it would serve. It is not customary for my people in my position to question the purposes. She paused. I find that I have done it anyway, and I find that I am going to continue. Another pause. I wanted you to know that this is a choice I made, not something you caused. A choice. Marcus looked at the rat in his jacket pocket, peacefully asleep on some equations he jotted down and hadn't needed. He looked at the display case in his memory, his name on a plaque in a future that could still be redirected. He looked at Solène, who had 1,000 years of institutional certainty behind her, and was choosing in this moment to put it down. Okay, he said, then let's figure out what we're building instead. What they built over the following 4 months was a proposal, not a machine, not this time, a document. Marcus had never worked on a document the way he worked on this one. It drew on his temporal observation records, on Keshari historical archives that Solène had clearance to access, and shared with him on the understanding that they were doing something that was technically within the rules and practically a significant departure from them, on first contact research going back 200 years in the Compact's history, and on a theoretical framework for what a genuinely bilateral interspecies integration would require that Marcus wrote in 4 nights of sustained concentration that left him looking, Ferris would have said, like a man who had recently survived something. They presented it to Stillwater first. He read it in silence, and then looked at Solène with an expression Marcus's translator rendered as profound discomfort/recognition of validity/conflict. This will require directorate review, Stillwater said. Yes, Solène said. The directorate will have significant objections. Yes, Solène said. Some of them will argue that Dr. Vale's temporal observation records should be classified and the machine's forward travel function disabled. I know, Solène said. Present the proposal anyway. Stillwater looked at Marcus for a long moment. His skin ran a short pattern that the translator said, with unusual confidence, meant something very close to, I see you. I'll present it, Stillwater said. The directorate review took 3 weeks, during which Marcus worked on calibration runs and tried not to pace and fed proof of concept rice crackers, and told himself he'd done what he could do. What happened next was above his pay grade, outside his expertise, beyond the edge of the map he'd been working from. He'd gone as far as his specific human stubborn useful gift could take him. The rest was somebody else's problem. Except it wasn't entirely. On the 15th day of the 3 weeks, Solène called him to a meeting room he hadn't been in before. Not too high ceilings this time, not wrong-angle walls. A human-scale room, proportioned correctly, with a round table and an even number of human and Keshari chairs. Actually an equal number, which he'd never seen in a compact meeting room, and 7 Keshari he didn't know seated in an arc. Not an arc like the first meeting, a circle, incomplete with space left for him and Solen to fill 2 of the gaps. The tall Keshari at the center of the circle was not Stillwater. It was someone older. Marcus had gotten good enough at reading Keshari to read old, and this one was old, and their luminescence ran in patterns that moved with the slowness of someone who had stopped being in a hurry a very long time ago. The translator in his ear said, with 3 asterisks indicating maximum confidence, Sovereign/Senior/Archaic honorific designation. This individual holds final authority in this context. Marcus sat in the human proportion chair. The old Keshari looked at him, then at Solen, then back at Marcus with the quality of attention that the room's silence sharpened to a point. "You have seen forward," the old Keshari said, in English that sounded nothing like a language that had been learned. It sounded like a language that had been lived in. "You have seen the name we gave you." "I saw the name," Marcus said. "Foundational contributor. I haven't contributed it yet." "No," the old Keshari said. "Not yet." "I want to understand," Marcus said, "what exactly I'm being asked to contribute to." The circle of Keshari was quiet. Solen's luminescence ran the pattern his translator had no human analog for, the one he'd started thinking of privately as the pattern of seeing clearly. "Ask your questions," the old Keshari said. So Marcus asked. He asked for 3 hours, which he suspected was not how directorate reviews normally went, but which nobody tried to stop. He asked about the 17 species. He asked about the ones that had resisted. He asked what the bilateral framework actually meant in practice, whether it had been attempted before, whether the compact had anything to gain from it that they couldn't get from the integration project as designed. He asked what Solen's position would be after this review. He asked, finally, a question that had been sitting at the back of his head for a year, and that he'd spent a year deciding whether to ask. "Do you know what you're doing to the species you contact? Not strategically. Do you actually know what it feels like from the inside? Do you have any human equivalent concept for what it is to wake up one day and discover that the framework you're living in was designed by someone else for purposes you weren't told about?" The old Keshari's luminescence ran a long, slow pattern. "That question," the old Keshari said, "is why we needed someone who would ask it." The bilateral framework proposal was approved with conditions. The conditions were significant, and the negotiation over them lasted 4 months, during which Marcus sat in more meetings than he'd sat in his entire previous career, and drank more bad coffee, and learned to read Keshari luminescence at a level that his earpiece, mildly offended, had stopped trying to compete with. The machine's forward travel function was not disabled. Marcus's temporal observation records were not classified. They were instead submitted as formal evidence in a directorate review of integration project methodology that was, Stillwater told him privately, the first such review in the project's history. Not all of the conditions were resolved in Marcus's favor. Several of them weren't, and he spent some nights being honest with himself about that, about the things he'd wanted and hadn't gotten and the distance between the future he'd seen in that corridor and the future that was actually being built. He'd learned at some point in the previous year that this was how real things worked. Not cleanly, not completely, not in the direction you aimed for exactly, but in a direction that had something to do with where you pointed. He saw Solen in the corridors of the ISRC building on a morning in the 3rd month of the negotiations, when the conditional framework had just cleared its 2nd review, and the 3rd was 2 weeks away. She was walking from the direction of the directorate wing with 3 senior Keshari staff, and she was talking, and she had the quality of someone who had been talking like this for a long time, with authority that sat naturally, without the formal register she'd used with him for the first 3 months, the register that he now understood had been a kind of armor. She saw him in passing and did not change what she was doing, which was the right call. She inclined her head by about 6 degrees, which was the Keshari equivalent of a nod, and her luminescence ran a single brief pattern that is earpiece, for the first time, translated with complete confidence. Recognition/regard/trust, no hedging qualifiers available. This translation is exact. Marcus inclined his head back. He kept walking. He had a meeting in 20 minutes and calibration runs after that, and a proposal revision to finish by end of day. And somewhere in the next few weeks, he was going to write up the bilateral framework theoretical foundations in a form that could be published. Not classified, not archived, actually published, in human accessible scientific literature, with his name on it and the compact's formal endorsement. His name on a plaque in a future he was going to build. He stopped in the corridor, alone for a moment, and let himself feel it, the specific quality of standing at the beginning of the thing the future version of you had already finished. The weight of it and the lightness of it and the strange satisfaction of understanding, for the first time, that he had not been brought here to build a machine. He had been brought here to build something that couldn't be built by anyone who hadn't spent a year asking the wrong questions and finding the right ones. His earpiece pinged, meeting in 19 minutes. He started walking again. In his jacket pocket, proof of concept, the rat woke up, assessed the situation, and went back to sleep. Some things you just had to trust.